My mother once told me I was a self-contained child. She said it with a sigh, as if it were a character flaw she'd had to endure. I realize now it wasn't a choice. It was a survival mechanism. My name is Elara, and for 28 years, I learned to parent myself because my parents were utterly consumed with their masterpiece, my older brother, Julian. He wasn't just the firstborn son. He was the family's sun, moon, and stars. I was a faint, distant satellite, my presence noted only when my orbit inconveniently crossed his. The evidence wasn't in dramatic pronouncements, but in the quiet, daily architecture of our lives. My childhood bedroom was a converted sewing room, small and facing the alley. Julian's was a palace at the front of the house, with a window seat and built-in shelves for his trophies, not for sports or academics, but for mere participation. His effort was celebrated, my achievements were expected, then swiftly forgotten. When I was 10, I spent months saving my allowance and birthday money for a specific chemistry set I'd seen in a fancy educational toy store. The day I finally bought it, I was ecstatic. Julian, 15 and bored, saw me setting it up at the kitchen table. "Looks stupid," he'd sniffed. An hour later, he decided it was fascinating. He pushed my carefully laid-out components aside and started mixing things at random. I asked him to stop. He told me to get lost. When I started to cry, my father's response was to take the set away from me asterisk. "You're causing a scene, Elara. Let your brother play. You can share." We never shared. He took, and I learned to let go. This pattern calcified as we grew. I worked 2 part-time jobs to pay for my own books and clothes in high school. Julian got a brand new car for his 16th birthday, which he promptly crashed. He had a new one within the month. I studied until my eyes burned, graduating as valedictorian. My parents' congratulations were a quick hug before they rushed off to Julian's community college orientation week, a party he was attending with his friends. He dropped out after 1 semester, citing burnout. They bought him a new gaming PC to help him recuperate. I built a life for myself, brick by solitary brick. I became a successful graphic designer, running my own freelance business. I own my cozy little condo, I had a healthy investment portfolio, and I had friends who felt more like family. I was proud of what I'd built, even if the architects of my childhood never once asked to see the blueprints. Julian, at 32, still lived in his renovated palace of a bedroom. He had a nebulous job at a friend's startup that seemed to consist mostly of posting on social media. My parents paid his rent, his car lease, his phone bill. He was their perpetual, pampered project. The earthquake that shattered our fragile family landscape was the death of my grandmother, my father's mother, Nana Rose. Nana Rose was a force of nature, a sharp, witty woman who had built a small chain of successful boutiques after her husband died young. She saw the dynamic in our house with painful clarity. She was my sanctuary. She'd take me for weekends, and we'd watch old movies and eat ice cream for dinner. "Don't let their smallness make you small, Ellie," she'd tell me, her voice firm. "You are the most capable person I know. They're just too blind to see it." Her funeral was a gray, drizzly affair. As we stood under a canopy of black umbrellas, a hand touched my elbow. It was Mr. Sterling, Nana's lawyer, a man whose demeanor was as pressed and proper as his 3-piece suit. "Elara," he said softly, "the reading of the will is tomorrow at my office. 10 a.m. Your grandmother was very specific. Your presence is required." The following morning, we filed into Mr. Sterling's wood-paneled office. My parents, Julian, slouching in an expensive sweater, myself, and Nana's 2 surviving sisters. The air was thick with the scent of lemon polish and anticipation. Mr. Sterling sat behind his vast desk, donned a pair of half-moon glasses, and began to read. The will was, initially, unsurprising. Her sisters received heirlooms and cash gifts. Her properties, the boutiques, were to be sold. Then he reached the core of the estate. "To my grandson, Julian," Sterling read, his voice devoid of inflection, "I leave the sum of $200,000 to be disbursed immediately, free of any trust or restriction." My mother let out a soft, satisfied sigh. My father nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Julian straightened up, a look of smug triumph spreading across his face. It was a king's ransom for a man who had never earned a dime. a reward for mere existence. Then Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and his gaze landed squarely on me. My father's smile didn't fade, but it became fixed like a mask. "To my granddaughter, Elara," he read, and I felt the room's atmosphere shift. "I leave the remainder of my estate, including the proceeds from the sale of all real estate and business assets, after all other bequests and taxes are satisfied." The silence was profound, broken only by the frantic ticking of a carriage clock on the mantelpiece. The asterisk remainder. My mind, trained for precision, instantly calculated the scale. The boutiques, the properties. It was an amount that dwarfed Julian's gift by an order of magnitude. It wasn't just money. It was a seismic declaration of belief from the only person who had ever truly had faith in me. It was Nana Rose's voice, echoing from beyond the grave. "I see you. You are enough." My mother was the first to break the silence. That can't be right," she whispered, her face pale. Julian shot to his feet. "What the hell, the remainder? She gets everything else. That's not fair." But it was my father's reaction that cut the deepest. He didn't look at me with anger, but with a cold, bewildered betrayal, as if I had personally orchestrated this. "There must be some mistake, Alistair," he said to Mr. Sterling, his voice tight. "My mother would never." She knew Julian was the one who needed the support. "Elara is already established." Mr. Sterling peered over his glasses, his expression unyielding. "The document is explicit, Robert. Updated and notarized 3 months ago. Rose was in full possession of her faculties. Her intentions are perfectly clear." The car ride home was a silent, rolling icebox. That evening, they called me into the formal living room, a place usually reserved for guests and reprimands. They sat on the large sofa, a united front. Julian paced near the fireplace, radiating aggrieved energy. "Elara," my father began, using his boardroom tone. "We need to address this. Unfortunate error in judgment from my mother. She was clearly not herself near the end. She became sentimental. She didn't understand the practical realities of this family." My mother chimed in, her voice pleading. "Honey, you have your business. Your lovely little home. You're so *independent*. Julian, this money could finally set him up. Give him a real start. It's only fair that you do the right thing. We can have the papers drawn up for you to sign your inheritance over to him." I looked at them, the 3 of them, standing in the home I had always felt a guest in, and I felt the last thread of my filial duty snap. The lifetime of slights, of being an afterthought, of having my accomplishments ignored and my needs dismissed, coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of resolve. "Nana Rose knew exactly what she was doing," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "She left that money to me, not to Julian, to me *, and I am keeping it." My father stood, his face a mask of cold fury. "If you walk out that door, if you choose avarice over the well-being of your own family, then consider yourself disowned. You will get nothing more from us. Not a penny, not a moment of our time. You will be dead to this family." The words, meant to be a death blow, felt instead like a liberation. They were finally saying the quiet part out loud. I looked at my mother, who was wringing her hands, and at Julian, who was watching me with a petulant, victorious glare, already counting my money as his own. "You've given me nothing my whole life but a lesson in how not to be," I said, my voice calm and final. "So this changes nothing." I turned and walked out of their house, the door clicking shut behind me with the sound of a chapter ending. The war for my own worth had begun, and they had just foolishly declared war on an heiress who had nothing left to lose. The silence that greeted me outside my parents' house was not empty. It was filled with the roaring absence of a lifetime of noise. The noise of their disappointment, my own desperate striving, the constant, low hum of not being enough. I got into my car, a sensible sedan I'd paid for myself, and sat for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I expected to cry. I expected to feel a gut-wrenching sorrow. Instead, I felt a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. The marionette strings had been cut, and for the first time, I was standing on my own, without the fear of their judgment to pull me off balance. The first thing I did was call Mr. Sterling. His secretary put me straight through. "Elara," he said, his voice a calm, professional anchor. "I anticipated I might hear from you." "Did you also anticipate my parents asking me to sign everything over to Julian?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "I have been your grandmother's counsel for 40 years, he replied evenly. "I anticipated very little else. Your grandmother did too. She was a very perceptive woman." A fresh wave of grief and love for Nana Rose washed over me. She had known the battlefield she was sending me into. "What do I do now?" I asked, the strength in my voice giving way to a slight tremor. "You do nothing," he stated. "You let the process unfold. The estate is now in probate. I will handle the sale of the assets. Your parents and brother have no legal standing to challenge the will. It is ironclad. Their only power lies in the emotional leverage they hold over you. My advice, for what it's worth, is to not grant them an audience." It was sound, logical advice, but it failed to account for the decades of psychological warfare, for the fact that the desire for their approval, even now, was a phantom limb I could still feel itching. The siege began not with a shout, but with a whisper campaign. My phone became a weapon. It started with my mother, her texts a masterclass in passive aggression. "Your father isn't sleeping. This stress is terrible for his blood pressure. I hope you're happy. Julian is so devastated. He really looked up to you, you know. He thought you were different." Then came the calls from extended family. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years called to tell me family was more important than money. A cousin messaged me on Facebook saying I was tearing everyone apart. My parents, it seemed, were playing the role of grieving, betrayed saints, and I was the greedy shrew who was kicking them while they were down. They were reframing my act of self-preservation as an act of aggression. I followed Mr. Sterling's advice. I did not engage. I muted group chats, set boundaries with relatives, and focused on my work. But the isolation was profound. The family ecosystem I had existed in, however toxically, was gone, and the silence it left behind was deafening. A month after the reading of the will, the first legal salvo was fired. Not from my parents, but from a lawyer representing Julian. It was a formal and utterly frivolous challenge to the will, citing undue influence. The claim was that I, in my weekly visits to Nana Rose, had manipulated her fragile state of mind into rewriting her will in my favor. I felt nauseous reading the document. It was a complete fabrication, a grotesque inversion of the tender, loving afternoons I'd spent with my grandmother. I forwarded it immediately to Mr. Sterling. His response was a single line in an email. "As expected, do not worry." A few days later, he summoned us all back to his office. This time, the atmosphere was not one of somber anticipation, but of a courtroom drama. My parents and Julian arrived with their lawyer, a slick, younger man who looked like he'd learned his craft from television dramas. Mr. Sterling and I sat on one side of the table, they on the other. Julian's lawyer began with pompous bluster, laying out their case. My frequent visits, my isolation of Nana Rose from the rest of the family, my sudden financial windfall. Mr. Sterling listened patiently, his hands steepled. When the young lawyer finished, he leaned forward slightly. "Are you quite done?" he asked, his tone politely bored. "Because I have a few documents of my own to enter into the record." He then slid a thin folder across the polished wood. My father opened it. Inside were notarized affidavits from Nana Rose's oncologist and her personal physician, stating she had been of impeccable mental clarity up until her final days. More damningly, there was a copy of a letter, in Nana Rose's own elegant handwriting, addressed to Mr. Sterling. My father's face drained of all color as he read it. He slowly passed it to my mother, whose hand flew to her mouth. "Shall I read the relevant passage aloud?" Mr. Sterling asked, not waiting for an answer. He picked up his own copy. "Alistair, I am making this change not out of spite, but out of love and clarity. I have watched Robert and Margaret coddle Julian into incompetence while ignoring the brilliant, resilient daughter they have in Elara. This is not a reward for her. It is an investment. I know she will use it to build a legacy, not to subsidize a life of indolence. I fear my son will contest this. If he does, show him this letter." He needs to see the truth, even if it hurts." The room was utterly silent. The truth, penned in my grandmother's unwavering hand, was a weapon more powerful than any legal argument. "My client," Mr. Sterling continued, his gaze icy as it swept over my parents and their deflated lawyer, "also has a very strong case for malicious prosecution and defamation. Pursuing this baseless challenge will not only cost you a significant amount in legal fees, but it could very well result in a countersuit that would jeopardize what little your son has been left. I suggest you drop this immediately and save what remains of your dignity." It was a checkmate in 3 moves. Julian's lawyer quickly gathered his papers, mumbling about needing to reconfer with his clients. My parents stood, their faces ashen with a mixture of shame and fury. They didn't look at me. They couldn't. As they filed out, my father paused at the door. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders were slumped, the proud, unyielding posture finally broken. "She always thought I was a failure," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone in the room. And in that moment, I understood the core of it all. This wasn't just about Julian. It was about my father's own lifelong feeling of never measuring up to Nana Rose's formidable standards. He had tried to create a son in his own idealized image, and in doing so, had recreated his own dynamic of disappointment. I was just a casualty in their silent, generational war. After they left, the strength that had been holding me upright evaporated. I slumped in the chair, trembling. Mr. Sterling placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Elara. The legal part, at least. They have no grounds. The estate is yours." I nodded, unable to speak. I had won. I had the money, the legal victory, the vindication, but it felt like ashes. I had wanted them to see me, to finally acknowledge my worth. Instead, I had forced them to confront their own failings, and in doing so, had likely severed the tie forever. I walked out into the afternoon sun, the heir to a small fortune and a vast, echoing emptiness. The battle was won, but the cost was a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach. I had my freedom, my future, and the chilling certainty that the war for my family's love was one I was never meant to win. The only path left was to turn away from the battlefield and build a new kingdom, one where I was finally, and irrevocably, the queen. The weeks following the legal showdown were a study in silence. The barrage of texts and calls ceased, replaced by a void that felt louder than any argument. It was the silence of a door slammed shut, its echo reverberating through the hollow spaces of my life. I had won, but victory tasted of dust and isolation. I threw myself into the mechanics of the inheritance. Mr. Sterling was a maestro, orchestrating the sale of Nana Rose's boutiques and properties with brisk efficiency. The numbers that began to appear in the newly established trust accounts were abstract, surreal. They represented security on a scale I had never dared to imagine. Yet, every bank statement felt like a piece of Nana Rose's soul, monetized. I would trace the numbers on the screen, feeling a profound mix of gratitude and a strange, aching guilt, as if I had profited from a loss. My parents' retaliation was not legal, but social. I learned through the strained, careful words of a cousin that my mother was telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated a dying woman and stolen Julian's birthright. The narrative was set in stone. I was the villain. I was now the subject of pitying glances at the grocery store and awkward silences when I ran into old family friends. The social ostracization was a subtle, constant pressure, 1,000 tiny cuts reminding me of my exile. Julian, true to form, played the heartbroken brother to perfection. He posted a series of vague, melancholic quotes on social media about family betrayal and trust being broken, each one garnering a flood of supportive comments from people who had no idea of the truth. He was the martyr, and I was the executioner. It was during this time, while sorting through the last of Nana Rose's personal effects from her apartment, that I found the journal. It was tucked inside her old sewing box, beneath spools of thread and a pincushion shaped like a tomato. The cover was soft, worn leather. My breath hitched as I opened it. It wasn't a daily diary, but a series of reflections, written in her sharp, sloping script. The entries were a revelation. They were filled with her frustrations about my father, his insecurity, his need to be seen as the patriarch. his blindness to anything that challenged his fragile self-image. Robert sees Julian as a second chance, she wrote in one poignant entry from years ago. A chance to raise a son who is celebrated, unlike he felt. But in lifting Julian up, he is grinding Elara into dust. He doesn't see that he is repeating the very pattern he resented in his own father. Another entry, dated just 2 months before her death, made me weep. Elara bought her own condo today. She didn't tell anyone. I found out from a mutual friend. She is so strong, so resilient. She builds her castles quietly, while they make a great noise building sandcastles for Julian that the tide will inevitably wash away. My money will not make her. It will merely give her the tools to build her castles taller and stronger, to shine a light so bright they will finally be forced to see her. Holding that journal was like having her arm around my shoulder. It was the antidote to their poison. She had seen it all. She knew the cost, and she had believed in me enough to arm me for this exact war. The discovery hardened my resolve. Their narrative was a lie, and I had the proof in my hands. But Mr. Sterling's warning echoed in my mind. Do not engage. A public fight would only drag Nana Rose's name through the mud and give their drama the oxygen it craved. I needed a different strategy, a quieter, more profound form of justice. The final provocation came from Julian. Emboldened by his social media support and simmering with entitlement, he showed up at my condo. I saw him through the peephole, his face a mask of aggrieved arrogance. I didn't open the door. Elara, I know you're in there, he shouted, his voice muffled by the wood. This is ridiculous. You can't just hide. We're family. You need to do the right thing. Just give me what's fair and we can forget this ever happened. I said nothing. I stood silently on my side of the door I owned, in the home I had built, and listened to the sound of his privilege crashing against my silence. He eventually left, slamming his fist against the doorframe in a final, pathetic display. That was the moment the last vestige of doubt vanished. He didn't want reconciliation. He wanted a payout. They all did. It was time to build my castle. I met with Mr. Sterling and a financial advisor. We crafted a plan. The Elara Rose Foundation was born. Its mission, to provide grants and mentorship to young women pursuing careers in the arts and entrepreneurship, fields where support was often scarce, where young women like me had to fight for every inch of ground. The first major project was the Nana Rose Boutique, not a chain for profit, but a non-profit collective. We would purchase a beautiful, historic building downtown and offer below-market rental space to female-owned small businesses. A jeweler, a bookbinder, a textile artist. It would be a hub of creativity and female empowerment, a permanent physical monument to my grandmother's spirit. When the press releases went out, when the foundation's website went live, the narrative began to shift. The story was no longer family feud over inheritance. It was local woman honors grandmother's legacy with transformative foundation. The local paper ran a feature, complete with a photo of me holding Nana Rose's journal and the original sign from her first boutique. The public response was overwhelming and positive. The comments on my social media, once a battleground, were now filled with support and admiration. People I hadn't heard from in years reached out to congratulate me. The tide was turning. My parents were caught in the riptide of their own making. Their whispers of manipulation and greed were drowned out by the loud, public evidence of my integrity and my purpose. They had tried to paint me as a monster, and I had responded by building a sanctuary in my grandmother's name. The most stunning development came from an unexpected source, Julian. He sent me an email. It was not an apology, that would have been too much to expect, but it was a surrender. Elara, it began stiffly. I see what you're doing with the foundation, I guess. I guess Nana was right. You were always the one who knew how to build things. Mom and Dad are. Not well, Dad barely leaves his study. Mom just cries, this has destroyed them. I'm moving out, getting a job, a real one. Maybe it's time I tried to build something for myself too. It was the closest I would ever get to victory from him. He was finally, belatedly, seeing the world as it was, not as our parents had constructed it for him. I did not reply. My silence was no longer a defense, it was a statement. I was done with them. I stood recently on the construction site of the future Nana Rose Boutique, hard hat on my head, blueprints in my hand. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and promise. This was my inheritance, not the money, but the mission. This was the castle I was building, not of stone, but of opportunity and legacy. My parents' house, with its silent rooms and unspoken resentments, was now their gilded cage. They were trapped in the narrative they had written, prisoners of their own favoritism. I, the invisible daughter, was now the one shining a light so bright it was impossible to look away. The poetic justice was perfect. They had tried to make me small to keep me in my brother's shadow. In response, I hadn't just stepped into the light, I had become the source of it. And in the brilliant, unforgiving glare of that light, their shadows had finally and utterly vanished.